Welcome in, my friends, and thank you for tuning in. The Gardening Simplified show with Stacy Hervella. I love doing the show with Stacy. I'll tell you what, I bet she's a person who does crossword puzzles in ink. She's a wordsmith.
I never touch a pencil. Not for crossword puzzles, not for anything. No, I absolutely do crossword puzzles in ink, and I love crossword puzzles, and I do Wordle. So, you know.
I see. I was right.
I was
Adriana's
a linguistics major.
Laughing over there, and yes, I'm sure she does crossword puzzles in ink. It's the Gardening Simplified show, and Stacy, we have to wave at our YouTube audience out there too.
Yes, and you brought flowers in to decorate our set because, as many radio shows and podcasts are doing these days, we are also putting this on YouTube. So it's the same version that you would be hearing on air, but it is a video version. And if you go there right now, you'll be able to see the fabulous flower arrangement that Rick harvested from his garden and brought in for our set dressing. It includes such flowers as zinnias, verbena, salvia, two types of salvia, the hyacinth bean, canna flowers. You got some burgundy pennisetum up in there. You got a hydrangea, a couple hydrangeas in there.
That's what I was waiting for. That's
well, they're on the other
stuff.
side. That's a tough stuff.
Tough stuff.
Very nice.
Yeah,
it looks fabulous. It's delightfully seasonal and colorful. So bringing a lot of cheer and seasonal color into the studio today.
I love hyacinth bean and flower at this time of the year. One of Thomas Jefferson's favorites. But
I did not know that.
We're moving into fall colors. As a matter of fact, I noticed just yesterday, speaking of orange and black, the box elder bugs are already collecting on the south side of my house, trying to get in.
There's no surer sign of fall than the box elder bugs and their congregation.
We have the harvest moon to look forward to, of course, the autumnal equinox, and fall is for planting. Now, this is great because the full moon rises around sunset, so for a number of nights after work, you can still get out there and work in your garden, Stacy.
Well, especially here in West Michigan because the sun sets so darn late. So, yeah, definitely extra gardening time happening at this time of year.
Fall is for planting, and we reminded folks of that last week. And I had one of our listeners, Stacy, reach out to me and said something that I thought was really profound. You know, I always talk about fall is for planting because the soil's nice and warm after summer. We get natural rainfall. The plants love it. It's a great time to plant. But this individual said to me, fall is for planting because many people are experimental gardeners. And in fall, when you purchase a plant or put it in the ground, you get to see what you're getting as opposed to putting a plant in the ground in spring. I thought that was great.
Yeah, you know, that is a really interesting way to think about it because in spring, things are newer. You're not really seeing where they're going to go. But in fall, you're kind of getting the payoff right there. And I love experimental gardeners. I totally understand the hesitant gardeners or the reluctant gardeners as well. But experimental gardeners are gardeners after my own heart. Yeah,
same here. Same here. I hope at some point on today's show, we'll talk about colorful mushrooms. And I brought it up only prior to us broadcasting this show because I found a mushroom that has an incredible botanical name. And as I mentioned, you do crossword puzzles in ink. And so we're going to hear from you. Well, let's do that right now. The mushroom, jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, has a interesting botanical name. Now, I'm going to give it the first shot here.
Okay.
So everyone can laugh, and then we're going to hear from Stacy. So the name of this mushroom, and the reason I do this is because I'm a fun guy, just like mushrooms. So here goes. Omphalotus olerus.
Yeah. I'd say you pretty much nailed it. I would say, it's actually, it looks confusing, but it's quite simple. It's Omphalotus olearis.
Oh, it sounds so much better when you say it.
But you know what's really funny or interesting about the name?
What's that?
It translates in Greek to navel looking or resembling a belly button.
Oh, wow.
Not even joking. So you're going to have to tune into segment 4, you're going to have to tune into Branching News at the end of the show to hear the news item about Omphallotus olearius. But until then, you will also be able to go to the show notes and see a picture of it and decide for yourself if it is indeed resembling a belly button.
Yeah, we want to encourage people to visit gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, and the show notes are posted there. Of course, also exciting for us to be broadcasting on YouTube, and make sure to subscribe and share that with your friends. While we're on the subject of words here in fall, and I brought along these cut flowers from my garden, I love word of the day, and the word of the day for today's broadcast is peduncle.
That is a very, very fun word
Peduncle.
to say. I encourage listeners, wherever they are at the moment, to just take a moment and say it out loud. Peduncle.
Peduncle. It sounds like an exercise bike that my Uncle Lewis would ride, a peduncle. But it's not, is it?
It is not. It is the scientific term for the little stem that attaches the inflorescence or entire flowering structure to the stem of the plant. And ped, P-E-D in Latin, translates to stem or stalk. So in addition to the peduncle, which, like I said, attaches the inflorescence to the stalk, you also have the pedicel, which in turn attaches the floret to the stalk that it is on. So there's a number of different words in Latin that we use in botany and horticulture that include peduncle. So you have peduncle, you have pedicel. You also have, in certain plant species, these delightful to say names: peduncularis, pedunculosis, and pedunculata.
Wow, sound like characters in a Dr. Seuss book is what it sounds like. What about petiole? But I did look up petiole, and that's the stem that attaches to a leaf and is something that we would pay attention to at this time of the year as the trees turn color and the leaves fall off the trees. Petiole is another one, but peduncle just is more fun to say.
You might say it's a slam peduncle. Sorry, Rick. I'm working on measuring up to you. It could be a couple more episodes, but it is my goal.
I love it. I love it. Hey, speaking of colorful foliage, Stacy, do you have a favorite in fall when it comes to flowering shrubs as far as fall color is concerned? Because for me, Sweet Spire or Itea, for those keeping score at home, 4 simple letters, I-T-E-A. I love Itea.
It is really a fantastic shrub for fall color and also for nice flowers in early summer. My favorite shrub for fall color could potentially be Heptacodium, which is actually kind of a tree, Heptacodium myconioides, since we're having fun with botanical names today. And it is a small tree. It's also known as seven sunflower, and It's blooming right now. And if you were to be able to see it in our trial gardens, it is absolutely buzzing with pollinators. Hummingbirds are going in and out and darting around all day. And once its white flowers fall, as they sort of wane, it leaves behind these beautiful dusty pink bracts. So it's almost like it has 2 blooms, the white flowers a little bit earlier in the season and then the pink bracts a little bit later in the season. And it's really it's actually a perfect all year round tree, but it is especially memorable in the fall.
Wow, great choice. Hey, before we go to break, want to mention too, I am in Art Prize this year and enjoying it with my exhibit Adrift, but it brings up marum grass. Do you say marum or marum?
Well, I actually, you probably predicted this.
Maram?
I actually say Ammophila breviligulata. And the reason I say that, marum grass is perfectly fine, but the reason that I say Ammophila breviligulata is because Ammophila, the botanical name of the ubiquitous marum grass, literally translates in Latin to sand lover. And
which makes sense.
Could there be a more apt description for marum grass than sand lover?
Which is the reason I bring it up. It's because it's the grass that helps hold the dune grass or hold the dunes, forms almost a snow fence that collects the sand as it blows to help build the dunes. And we're seeing that reestablish itself on the beaches of West Michigan after the erosion event of 2019 and 2020. That's what the exhibit Adrift is all about, and you can see it at the Hyatt Place in downtown Grand Rapids. But okay, let me try Ammophila.
There you go.
Good.
Or you can come out to go see it in Art Prize and then come out to the lakeshore and see it yourself.
Ammophila what?
Breviligulata.
All right. I think we'll have it in the show notes. Make sure to visit gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. We're going to take a quick break, and after the break, Stacy once again is going to put a plant on trial. You won't want to miss this. Stay tuned.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Gardening Simplified show. I'm Stacy Hervella, and I'm joined in the studio with the one and only Rick Weiss. And before we get to this week's plant on trial, which I'll give you a little hint is going to be a smokebush, I did just want to say a few more things about marram grass or Ammophila breviligulata because it is an absolutely fascinating plant. And, living on the lakeshore, I've kind of taken it for granted. I see it all over, and I never really thought all that much about it. I knew it played an important role in dune stabilization. But did you know, Rick, that the Great Lakes are the only inland area in the world where it is actually endemic?
I did not know that.
Yeah, so it's mostly only native to coastal, oceanic, or seaside habitats. The Great Lakes are the only inland area where you will actually find it as an endemic species.
Wow.
And because it is so prolific and such a durable and tough plant, in many areas around the world, particularly in northern areas like Scandinavia and the British Isles, where there were harsh winters, they would harvest it for fuel, they would harvest it for cattle feed, and they would end up stripping their seashore and end up with all sorts of erosion, and quickly became very apparent to them that it was an important part of the ecosystem and of maintaining their soil and the health of their environment. And so they would replant it. And also it was traditionally used for thatch in the infamous thatched roof cottages that you would see even today around Ireland and England. So very fascinating plant, and one that, I love plants that you see all the time and they just seem like this kind of mundane thing, but they actually have this amazing backstory.
Yeah, here in West Michigan, people would call it beach grass.
Yep.
But you have the marram grass, M-A-R-R-A-M, for people who are keeping score at home, and the sand reed grass, which has an inflorescence on it that almost looks like a panicum or a switchgrass.
Yep.
But everybody loves the marram grass because of that really distinctive inflorescence at the top.
It is definitely unmistakable.
Unmistakable.
So moving on to this week's plant on trial, we are talking about the velvet fog smokebush. And the reason for this is because we did get a number of listener questions to our inbox, and I want to thank those listeners for writing to us. And if you have a gardening question, you can also write to us. You can email us at help@gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, or just visit gardeningsimplifiedonair.com and use the contact form. But one of the listeners sent in an ID request, a plant ID request, which obviously does not lend itself super well to answering on the radio or on air. But I did want to take the opportunity, because the plant that he sent did turn out to actually be a smokebush, to take the time to talk about smokebush. And the one that I chose to talk about today is the velvet fog. And part of it is because smokebush, if you're not familiar with it, and do you grow smokebush, Rick?
Yes. Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's a beautiful plant, absolutely beautiful. And when it is in bloom, or more technically accurately in seed, everyone is like, oh my gosh, what is that? Because it really does. I mean, it comes by the name smokebush earnestly, because it does look like it's just like in the middle of puffs and puffs of smoke, because the flowers give way to these very wispy, billowy, smoke-like clouds. So people think of it as a summer plant, but what a lot of people don't realize about smokebush is that the majority of them have absolutely stunning fall color.
Well, and this is a plant that you as marketers, I'm sure in your description would say, has visual interest.
It does, to say the very least. Botanically, smokebush is known. This is another fun one to say. I guess fun botanical scientific names
I want to hear this one.
Are the theme of today's show. Catinus cajigria.
I was way off. I was going to say cajigria.
Well, you might be right.
Sounds like something I order at the bar in Mexico.
Actually, the cajigria or cajigria is the ancient Greek word for the plant. It is native to Greece. We actually have some native Catinus species in North America, but the main smokebush that people grow is actually native to Europe. So the cajigria part comes from the ancient Greek word, and Catinus was another Greek plant that somehow got applied to this plant, and then Linnaeus or whoever named it decided to put the cajigria in there. Did you know, botanically speaking, it is related to cashews?
No way.
Yes.
That's nuts.
You would not immediately notice a resemblance.
Well, it is one of these plants that throws cashew to the wind. Sorry, Stacy.
You would not immediately guess that to look at the plants. It does not have any nut-like seeds. Also related to our beautiful native staghorn sumac. And like I said, really nice fall color. They're very hardy. And so the person who had contacted us asking for the ID had found it somewhere on the East Coast and wanted to know if he could grow it in Michigan. And the answer to that is absolutely. Very hardy. Hardy to USDA Zone 4 and heat tolerant through about USDA Zone 8. So that means a pretty good proportion of the country can successfully grow Smokebush. And the Velvet Fog is a proven winner's color choice variety that was developed right here at Spring Meadow Nursery in West Michigan by my boss, Tim Wood, and he was working towards a couple of different breeding goals. So he wanted more colorful blooms. So a lot of the smoke bushes that people grow are purple, and they have purple smoke. This one actually has bright pink smoke, and it's very distinctive, especially because the foliage is blue-green. So it has a very strong contrasting effect. He was going for a more lush habit. So one thing, if you grow smokebush is they can do some pretty funky things in terms of the way that they grow. They can kind of have a little bit of a mind of their own when it comes to branching and create some sort of weird spots. They're artistic, let's say.
Yeah.
And so he was trying to develop a more even, rounded habit as well as get more blooms. And he did achieve the increased blooming. And the way he described it in the first catalog that we published it in was, are you ready for this, Rick? I think you're going to like it.
Okay, let's hear it.
More smoke than a Kiss concert.
Oh, it rock and rolls all night and parties every day.
So I know that reference may be lost on some of our listeners, but others.
Rock and roll.
I'm sure some of our listeners are like, wait, they smoked in concerts? But the other ones are like, who's Kiss? But more smoke than a Kiss concert is how Tim Wood, the breeder, describes his creation, the Velvet Fog Smokebush. And the velvet part comes from the sort of waxy, velvety looking leaves. It's really just a fantastic plant for sun or shade. So let's get into how you can grow the Velvet Fog Smokebush if you are so inclined and looking for another multi-season interesting plant to add to your landscape. So full sun or part shade. Now, if you do have a purple leaf variety like our Winecraft Black or Royal Purple, which is another variety on the market, you're going to want more sun because if you put that in too much shade, it's going to get kind of muddy looking. You've seen that probably before.
I have seen that before. Although I would ask you, Stacy, because I know we'll get it from our listeners, any type of shrub like this, one of the first questions out of their mouth is going to be, can I prune it? Should I prune it? How do I prune it?
And my answer to that is do not prune it. Avoid pruning it.
Oh, yay. This is easy.
It is. I talked a little bit a few moments ago
Close,
about it.
But no cigar.
About its strange growth habit. And what it does, even if you don't prune it, it will shoot up with a very straight stem and then put out this crazy spray of little branchlets. And so you end up with sort of like a fireworks display, which sounds nice and is probably more interesting in winter. But in spring, you end up with this really strange looking thing. So we actually discourage regular pruning of smokebush. Now, what you can do if you're trying to go for a specific shape or habit, you can go ahead and selectively remove branches in late winter or early spring to get that look you desire. But overall, this is going to be a pretty hands-off plant. Once you get it in the ground, you're picking the right spot. You don't really have to do a lot. Give it water its first couple of years. Once it's established, it's quite drought tolerant. And so it's not even going to need a lot of water. And you can really just sit back and enjoy the show. So what happens with smokebush, a lot of people don't realize this, but the flowers themselves are pretty nondescript. Most people don't even realize it's in flower because the smoke that we've been talking about is actually the seed heads.
Oh.
So it happens after the flowers. So the flowers are just these tiny little dinky things.
So you have to look for it.
You do have to look for it until it goes.
You have to be a smoke detector.
Oh my gosh. I don't know. I'm torn between should I have seen this coming or...
Sorry, continue on.
All right, I guess you're on fire today, Rick.
Thank you. Oh, well done. See, she's getting into this.
So anyway, the Velvet Fog Smokebush, you will find it at your local garden center in the distinctive white Proven Winners container. You can also visit provenwinnerscoloredchoice.com to find a local retailer to find more information about the Velvet Fog, or you can make it simple and go to gardeningsimplifiedonair.com and see it in the show notes. So listen, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be back. We're going to open up the mailbag and answer your questions. Hey, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified show with Stacey Hervella and Rick Weiss. And it is mail call time to open up the gardener's mailbag and answer the questions that have come in over the last week. If you have a gardening question, we would be delighted to help you resolve it. All you have to do is email help, that's HELP, at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, or you can even go to our website, gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, and use the handy contact form where you can even attach a photo. And a number of listeners have already done that when they have reached out to us. So, Rick, what's our first question in the mailbag today?
Well, our first question, Stacy, is from Philip, and he says, "Hi, I have an apple tree I purchased from the Arbor Day Foundation back in the early 1980s. Very large, greenish yellow. Apples are very hard. They keep well in the root cellar." But he asks if there's a way to identify the variety. The tree is old. I'd like to get a new one. So he wants to know whether or not he can identify this tree, and then also whether or not he can take the seeds and start some on his own.
Well, those are two excellent questions, Philip. So thank you so much for your question. So the answer to the first part about identifying the apple is that is beyond my area of expertise. And I would suggest that you probably are going to need to contact an apple expert to get to the core of the matter. It was just, I couldn't resist. No, but seriously, the apple world is extremely there's so many different types of apples, and there's so many specialists who dive deeply into the world of apples. Now, I would say if you got your apple tree in the 80s, it's unlikely to have been some really esoteric, strange variety. And there are a lot of what are known as antique orchards, abandoned orchards throughout the Northeast and the Midwest, where apple trees were planted and then abandoned. And those do sometimes reveal varieties that were thought to be lost to time or extinct. If yours is that recent, it probably isn't something extremely esoteric, but it could be something quite unique. And you obviously enjoy it. You enjoy the storage characteristics of it. And it sounds like it'd be very suitable for cider production, which is always a good thing if you are so inclined. So I would encourage you, especially here in West Michigan, we have an abundance of apple experts.
Oh, incredible.
Huge apple producing region out here. Visit a farm, visit an orchard, and see if they can provide some insight, because they would definitely know. You can send us a picture. Our plant breeder here, Megan Matai, did a lot of work on apples in her graduate degree, so I would be happy to show it to her and see if she has any insight. But the other part of your question about propagating it as it gets older. Now, I would not recommend trying to grow it from seed. Nothing wrong with trying to grow it from seed. You can certainly do that if you wish, but you are unlikely to get something that resembles the parent or is an exact copy of the parent. And the reason for that is because pretty much all apples that are, grown for eating or processing are grafted.
Okay.
And what that means is that they have someone takes a rootstock that's disease resistant, hardy.
A wild rootstock.
It could be a wild rootstock, right. Or sometimes it's a dwarfing rootstock. It's a rootstock that transmits its hormones into the top and actually will help keep that variety a little bit smaller and more dwarf and manageable. And then they take the desirable variety, or the variety that they actually want to eat, and they cut it and they tape it together with some special tape, and then those grow together as one tree. And what that does is it really helps to make sure that that plant is consistently the one that you want, with no genetic surprises thrown in there, which is what happens when you grow something from seed. So there's no harm in experimenting with growing it from seed, but when you think about the amount of time it's going to take to actually get an apple tree from a seed or a productive apple tree, you could have a lot of time and space into something that's not doing what you want to do. Now, anybody with very basic equipment can experiment with grafting. So what you could do is go ahead and plant those seeds, let them germinate, let them get to grow about a pencil thickness, and then it would be ready for grafting. And then you would just take a cutting of the desirable apple that you have that's a similar thickness. There's tons of tutorials online on how to graft yourself and lots of interesting little sleeves and things that you can buy that make it a lot easier to be successful compared to the olden days when everything was just manual labor, and experiment with it. And then that way you'll be sure to get that parent plant that you want as the main productive part of the plant. So that would be my advice to you, Philip. I think it's a great gardening project, and I really admire your ability to maintain this tree for all of these years and your desire to perpetuate it even longer.
Yeah, I hope that helps out, Philip. And, I want to go back to that core joke a minute, Stacy, because you just pulled that right out. I would have to say that Sir Isaac Newton is probably very proud of you right now. That joke just plunked out of air, the gravitational force. Okay. All right. Here we go. Another question. Cam from Kentucky. Can you cut back a butterfly bush? Not deadhead, but actually cut it back. And Stacy, I would have to say on the radio program I did before we started this program, that was one of the top questions we would get all year long. Can I prune back my butterfly bush? And if I do, how far do I prune it back?
Well, it's a great question, and I cannot blame anybody for asking it, because as lovely and wonderful as butterfly bushes are, when those flowers start to fade, it's not their finest moment. So it's not unusual to look at a butterfly bush that's been flowering and really abundant for several weeks or months and say, I kind of need to do something to clean it up. So normally pruning your butterfly bush would take place, especially for those of us in cold climates, in early spring. And I always recommend that you leave, especially in cold climates, leave your plant intact over winter, because butterfly bush in zone 5, even parts of zone 6, will typically get a little bit of winter dieback. Yep. And the more likely something is to get winter dieback, the more you want to leave it intact over winter, so there's more body to kind of weather the storm, as it were, and really stand up to any damage that does occur. So leave it intact over winter. If you do want to cut off the seed heads because you can't stand looking at them, that's perfectly fine. You can just take a pair of head shears and snip it all over and get those off. No problems there, but save the heavy pruning for early spring. And I also always recommend that people wait to prune in spring until the plant is actually starting to leaf out. And the reason for that is because it makes your job so much easier, because you aren't guessing anymore at where to cut.
Right, exactly.
The plant is saying, here, cut me right here. I put a little leaf out, cut just above those leaves. Right. And as far as how far to cut back, I generally encourage, and this is something you can get away with when you wait for the plant to leaf out, I encourage a very hard prune on butterfly bushes, because if you prune them too lightly, you get what I call a second story plant. And that is to say, it's going to grow really tall and only bloom at the tippy top. So you'll only be able to enjoy it from your second story, if indeed you have a second story. So
I agree. Stacy, I always tell people to prune them with confidence. It's a woody plant that almost acts like an herbaceous perennial. And I have found that it blooms more prolific when we do prune it hard. But before we move from this question, there are wonderful new varieties for our listeners that have a tendency to stay nice and short.
That's true, yes. And we have the Lo and Behold series here. We have the Pugster series. Both of those are dwarf series of butterfly bushes that stay in the 2 to 3 foot range. But even then, I do recommend that people still prune them in spring, because even though they won't get to be maybe a second story plant, they'll still be a first story plant, and you won't get that nice, especially if you look at the photos that we use here at Proven Winners of our butterfly bush, they're not going to look like that with that nice kind of tuffety look all covered in flowers, unless you do go ahead and prune them pretty hard. So even if you have a dwarf variety, I do recommend pruning. We have lots of resources on caring for your butterfly bush, and we will, of course, link those in the show notes.
Well, that's well-rooted advice. And on real quickly to another woody plant, Rose of Sharon bushes. Same thing here, Stacy. People always asking about pruning on Rose of Sharon. And I view Rose of Sharon similar to, and this is a question from Sarah in Indiana. I view Rose of Sharon similar to Buddleia in that it is a plant that can benefit from some pruning.
It definitely can. The wood gets a little bit lazy and weak if you don't prune it. And Sarah's question, I wanted to include it in today's show because she asks if the funny things on her plant are more buds or if they're the seed head or what. And it's not uncommon at all for people to find very much confusion in their Rose of Sharon now because the flower falls off and the thing that it leaves behind looks like a bud. But the surefire way to test is to just go ahead and take your pruners out there, cut it in half. And what you're going to see, assuming that it is actually a seed pod, is something that looks a lot like okra because okra is also related to Rose of Sharon. So if you're seeing those seeds in there, that means it's a seed head. You can prune it off if you want. You don't have to. But unfortunately, that does mean that the show for the Rose of Sharon is probably over for the season. And with that,
Stacy, before we go to break, I got to mention to you, I love okra.
I love okra too. And I'm not even Southern.
You know why I love it?
Why?
I'm from Oklahoma. Go ahead.
You aren't even. You're from West Michigan.
It's just a good line.
I don't know, Rick. That might be taking it too far when you've got to joke about your origins to make the pun. In any case, we'll be over here debating the validity of Rick's latest pun, and we'll be back after this break with the branching news.
Welcome back to the Gardening Simplified show with Stacy Hervella and me, Rick Weist. Okay, we got to get back to a story that we talked about briefly in segment 1, the glowing speaking of bioluminescence, mushrooms. This is amazing. Jack-o'-lantern mushrooms.
It absolutely is amazing. I had no idea until you sent me that article this morning that we had really anything bioluminescent here in Michigan. But we have a mushroom that is actually fairly ubiquitous and glows in the dark.
That is so cool. Love to walk through the woods and see that. And the bioluminescence, this mushroom actually glows, and we have to remind ourselves that mushrooms are not true plants. They're feeding off of something else, correct?
Right. They are eating or decomposing the roots typically, but other organic matter in the soil. They're not photosynthesizing. They're not green. So they're dependent on certain relationships with trees and so forth that are decomposing. Now, it does have to be dark, right, for you to see these things glowing. So you're going to have to stay up a little late. But I think I would just totally freak out if I was walking in the woods and saw some glowing mushrooms. So I'm pretty excited about the prospect.
I'll tell you what, fun guys stay up late. Okay, so if you want to keep score at home, search engine of your choice, Stacy, one more time, that technical name, if somebody wanted to look it up. That is Omphallotus?
Yes.
Olerarius?
Yes.
Got it.
Or the jack-o'-lantern fungus. If you look that up, you'll probably find a good result as well. It's a great thing. You can find things however works for you.
I love it. This from Lubbock, Texas. I love this farm. They have a corn maze every year. It's called the Addledew Farm. And because of drought, they're forgetting about the corn because corn uses a lot of water.
A lot, yeah.
And what they're doing is they're using a sorghum, Sudan grass, and these hybrids can grow to 10 or 12 feet. And I guess are creating some pretty cool mazes there in Texas when they can't grow corn.
That's interesting. I'm not sure that sorghum maize has quite the same ring as corn maize just yet. But, with some clever marketing behind it, it might just be the new thing. And people will refuse to go to corn mazes and prefer the sorghum mazes instead.
That's fantastic. And of course, this past week in the news, the funeral of Queen Elizabeth, and all eyes on England in this past week. But I wanted to share with our listeners that I've learned that King Charles is very much into gardening. He's crazy about gardening.
He's a lifelong vegetable gardener. He's very, very serious about gardening.
That's really cool. Now, he's going into the perfume world. Charles is teaming up with some folks to launch a perfume inspired by his greatest passion, gardening. As I understand it, Stacy, what they're doing is they're going to share this perfume with the general public. The royal family creates a perfume for the family every year. The Queen would receive her own perfume, but now they're producing a perfume that they're going to be able to sell, and it's based on now King Charles' love for gardening.
That is really, I'm very interested in perfume, as I think a lot of gardeners are, because so many scents are derived from plants. So I will be very eager to hear about the formulation of Prince Charles's new perfume. I didn't even know that about the royal family.
Oh, it's fantastic. And of course, he is now King Charles. And Stacy, I guess you could say he is front and center. Center.
Center?
S-C-N-T-E-R.
Yeah, that, if you need to spell out the pun, I'm not sure it's going to work on radio, Rick, but I appreciate you trying.
Then let's move on to another news story. A Palestinian farmer has discovered a floor mosaic while planting in his garden. He was planting an olive tree, and he found an ancient floor mosaic. Experts are calling it one of the greatest archaeological treasures ever found in that Gaza area. That's pretty cool.
I can't even imagine the possibility of finding something like that digging in your garden. My husband's grandfather, late grandfather, was from Israel, and he unearthed this incredible amphora in his. He was a big gardener, and he was digging in his backyard and just unearthed this absolutely amazing amphora. It was just buried there.
Wow.
Things are a little bit different here in the U.S. and, of course, in a moister climate where things often get damaged or decomposed. But I would definitely encourage everyone to visit the show notes so they can see the picture in that link, which we will put.
When I'm out in the garden and I'm using the shovel and I clunk on something, I always hope that I'm going to find like a Campbell soup can with coins in it or something, and it's never happened to me yet.
I found a couple. So I live in an older house, and I found a couple of interesting things. I found some old canning lids, like the kind that are old, like glass-lined canning lids. I found some like 70s action figures. I found some a lot of dish and glass shards, but nothing that's going to make me rich. Just kind of like that's neat. But it's still, I don't think even as an adult you totally get over that like treasure hunt thing that you have as a kid.
Exactly. Now here in West Michigan, of course, we love the beautiful sunsets, and in fall the sunsets are gorgeous. But I wanted your opinion on this, Stacy, because in the news, they're talking about a study. It's a research project. It's being conducted by the University of Idaho and Boise State University. And in this study, they're thinking that the wildfire smoke that affects our sunsets here in West Michigan actually can make them quite beautiful. That the wildfire smoke blanketing the West is not only affecting people and animals, but maybe even crops grown underground like potatoes. Interesting to think about.
Interesting. So they're saying it's affecting the soil, or is it that the particles settle on the foliage of the plant and they can't photosynthesize?
That's what they're trying to figure
out. Effectively? Wow.
Yeah. So they have funded this project and trying to figure out why in the world these potatoes, they were undersized, and someone surmised that possibly it was all of the smoke in the West, and they're going to try and figure this out. So it's pretty good.
Well, no one wants small potatoes.
Exactly. And you know what? On this segment, I'm not going to even give you a bad pun. I'm just going to be a spectator. Right. Okay. Let's find another story.
I got to keep my eyes on this one.
Let's find another story here. Oh, USDA. So the USDA is promoting the People's Garden for the People's Department. Now, the USDA is known as the People's Department because it's a phrase that was coined by Abraham Lincoln.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln decided that the USDA would be the People's Department, and the USDA has developed a project called People's Gardens, empowering communities to participate in local food production and provide diversity and resiliency to the food supply chain, which of course became a big topic of conversation during COVID. And so the USDA is promoting this. As a matter of fact, if you want to go to usda.gov/People's Garden, and we'll put it in the show notes, rather interesting because it was Abraham Lincoln himself who said the most valuable of all arts will be the art of deriving a comfortable subsistence from the smallest area of soil. Our founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, or you take somebody like Abraham Lincoln, they had a true appreciation for gardening, soil, farming, and eating plants. You find that over and over again.
Well, there's actually a fantastic book called Founding Gardeners that's specifically about them and their engagement with gardening that I would highly recommend. It's by a great author, Andrea Wolf, and fascinating read.
I want to thank Adriana for all her great work. Fabulous. We couldn't do this show without her. Also, John Ilk back at the studio. And Stacy, always a privilege and pleasure to do this show with you. And I'm sorry for all the bad puns today.
Well, Rick, I would expect nothing less. And you know what? It brings a lot of spice and variety to the Gardening Simplified show. So visit gardeningsimplifiedonair.com to get a recap of the day's events and explore further on your own.
Send us your pictures and questions. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next week here on the Gardening Simplified show.